Okay, we begin our talk this evening and we share with you the story of St. Francis of Assisi. It's part 5 of a series of talks taken from the beautiful little book by Chris Park, a former academic who found the life of Francis of Assisi challenging, and he felt in his heart that he had something to say for the world. Tonight we resume part 5. And part 5 looks at the youth of St. Francis. Not a great deal is known about the first half of Francis' life because details about his childhood and youth are particularly scant. His early life was probably quite uneventful and certainly did not attract the attention or capture the imagination of his earliest biographers, Solano and Bonaventure. Between the ages of about 7 and 11, he is believed to have received a normal education of a medieval schoolboy at the priest's school at the Church of St. George, San Giorgio, situated on the site of what is now the Church of Sainte Claire, Santa Chiara, where by all accounts he was a fairly average scholar. By today's standards, his education was extremely limited, but it was typical of the times. He read and spoke in Latin, but not well, and he learned elementary arithmetic, church choir singing, and the basics of his Christian faith. He learned to read and write, the latter badly, but with a firm hand, so that in the days to come he would always dictate. But he only had 4 years of schooling. He was never anything like an intellectual, never a well-read man. Indeed, reading and writing were always challenges for him. This lack of enthusiasm for learning was to resurface in his later life, in disputes over learning and libraries for the friars in his order. Whilst he was clearly no great scholar and lacked any real appetite for learning, Francis nonetheless had a gift for learning languages. He learnt a dialect of French, both from his mother and on the business trips with his father to France. It was probably provincial. His mother's native tongue and the language of the troubadours. He also learned to speak new forms of Umbrian, which at that time was evolving into what we today call Italian. Like all mothers, Pizia had dreams for her son, that he would live a long and happy life, be fulfilled, and do great things. She took great pride in her son, who displayed such a sensitive, caring nature, which today we might be inclined to think of as a strong feminine side. Mother and son, both soft-natured, were by all accounts very close throughout his childhood. Peter appears to have been a more distant figure to Francis, with a more sober outlook and less obvious emotional attachment. Like his peers, Francis was expected to grow up fast. In those days, he would have been treated as a man by the age of about 15. Today we would think of that as a stolen childhood. Most newborns did not survive the first few months, and a majority of those who did never reached adolescence. How sad and how tragic. Regarding his apprentice, Chris Park says Francis' destiny, certainly in his father's mind, was to take over the running of the family cloth business and continually building up the family's fortune because we know that the father was a very wealthy member of the community and lots of contacts, and of course widely travelled. After Peter took him out of school in 1194, aged about 11, Bonaventure tells us that Francis was employed by the father as soon as he had acquired some knowledge of letters. Francis became an apprentice, helping his father by working in the family shop, selling fabrics and materials. From time to time, he accompanied his father on the business trips to France and to Holland, learning the trade that would be his future. Spoto reflects on how, watching and heeding Peter, Francis acquired the special skills required in the trade, the fine points of weights and measures, of pricing and the art of bartering. He also learned the potent effect of dress, liveries, badges, hoods, stockings, cloaks, capes, and hats, all of them in richly hued fabric and fine textures. So clearly the family's business was for the very well-to-do of society at that time. The tint and cut of each was particular to every individual and family, and to each station in society. Pichia looked after the shop and business when the men were away. But Francis did not share his father's work ethic, nor his hunger for wealth, success, and prestige. This was not because he was an ungrateful son who took things for granted, but because he had a different nature and outlook to his father. The difference was in time to create an unbridgeable divide within the family, and to propel Francis along a very different path to the one his father had in mind for him, and for which he had worked hard to prepare him. During his teenage years, however, it was manifest most obviously in Francis' extravagant and hedonistic lifestyle, which frustrated and displeased his father, who expected a somewhat more serious outlook on life from his son and heir. Francis was reluctant to invest all his time and energy in working in the family business, not out of ideology or principle, but because he'd better things to do with his time. He was well known in Assisi and enjoyed a busy and high-profile social life. He loved to sing, to dress up, and organize parties for his friends. He comes across as the archetypal party animal. As a teenager, Francis lived a life of luxury, thanks to his parents' indulgence. As biographers have noted, he was handsome, happy, gay, gallant, and courteous. And he lent himself to the life of popularity with a certain innocent extravagance. And he lived life to the full, helped in his self-indulgent existence by his father's huge fortune. Francis loved having money in his pocket, and it attracted the attention and friendship of many of the other teenagers of Assisi. He liked the finer things in life and spent a fortune on fine clothes for himself. He was an early advocate of dress to impress. He had a reputation as light-hearted and funny, was generous, and even liked singing in public. Francis had many friends who he loved entertaining with the wine flowing freely. Many of their social gatherings would have centered on or passed through the Piazza Commune, the main square in the center of Assisi. The piazza would also provide the setting for a number of important episodes later in his life, but without the laughing and singing of his carefree youth. In short, Francis was gregarious and loved to be the center of attention. He was an exhibitionist who enthusiastically played the roles of dedicated follower of fashion and leader of the pack in town. Although the teenage Francis can come across as a spoiled brat, Spoto perceptively points out that he was the sort of teenager with whom it was easy to become impatient with, but who was also difficult to dislike. A nice way of putting it. A much less tolerant view of Francis' adolescence is shown by his first biographer Silano, who admittedly was prone to exaggeration as he constructed his life of Francis. It was in Silano's interest to portray young Francis as the most wayward soul imaginable, to underline the pronounced contrast with the Francis of later years as the ultimate servant of God. Silano writes of his youth, who from his earliest years was brought up by his parents to be self-willed and to pursue the vain pleasures of the world. And having followed their wretched way of life for many years, he himself became even more worldly and loose-living than many. Until almost the age of 25, he wasted and squandered his time miserably. Harsh words, perhaps, but he had harsher words in store. Whilst young Francis was clearly no saint, just how much of a sinner was he? Because one of his quotes is quite interesting and I found really supportive. He said, "Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future." Food for thought. The extent of his pleasure-seeking remains a matter of some debate, but there are hints in Silano's comments that while Francis was in the heat of youth, still ardent in sin, and while his lustful instincts urged him to gratify himself in every way, and while roused as he was by the venom of the old serpent, he did not know how to hold himself in check. Most of his biographers have tactfully avoided anything to do with his sexual adventures, and we have no reliable way of knowing whether Francis gave in to his lustful instincts. Spoto suggests that while we should guard against overstating the extent of his sexual experience, it would be difficult to think of him as diverging from his comrades in only this one area of adolescent experimentation. This was a sexually anarchic era, and the town was full of randy, undisciplined, and hedonistic youngsters. Bonaventure springs to Francis' defense, telling us that he never suffered himself to be carried away, like the lawless youths around him, by sensual pleasure, albeit he was a gay, in brackets, happy, and joyous spirit. The jury must remain out, but if he did indeed give in to his lustful instincts, a sense of shame and regret may explain why in later years he had such a critical dislike for his own body, which he referred to as Brother Ass. Why he adopted such a relentlessly aesthetic lifestyle, and why not long before he died, he commented that he was still capable of fathering a child. Interesting. Behind the mask, despite his hedonistic teenage lifestyle, Francis was always charming, courteous, and generous to others. He also started to become more aware that many people were denied the comforts and privileges that were being heaped upon him, and that he was in danger of taking for granted. His soft side never fully eclipsed by his love of la dolce vita. One incident in France's youth provides a glimpse behind the mask and shows that even the great rebel rouser had a conscience. The story goes that one day, while Francis was busy serving in his father's shop, a beggar walked in begging for money and food. Francis sent the man straight back out. It was embarrassing to have him there while rich customers were in. He was later to confide to close friends that he regretted doing that. It dawned on him that whilst he was generous beyond compare to himself and his friends, he had treated the needy with contempt and disrespect. That thought was to haunt and challenge him in the years ahead. By temperament, Francis was romantic and emotional, probably something of a daydreamer. From an early age, he was something of an idealist, with big ideas of what he would do and achieve. These were usually a million miles from what his father was imagining for him, his son and heir. But his mother loved her son deeply, and she nurtured him and encouraged him to think big. To think big thoughts and dream big dreams. That's a mother for you. His ideas and dreams during these early years, which would find expression later in his life, centered upon his love of poetry and song, and his interest in knights and chivalry. In the former he was relatively unusual for the time, whereas in the latter he was very much a product of the time. The troubadours were travelling poets and minstrels who wrote poems and sang about chivalry and courtly love, both physical and allegorical. They had good breeding. Most were aristocrats or knights, and they came mainly from southern France, particularly Languedoc, northern Spain and northern Italy. They were well educated, highly creative, and much admired. What an interesting life this Francis had. It would be true to say he was a wild man. But did he sow his oats? No one knows. It says here, Francis learned about troubadours through his mother, who was born and raised in France. He experienced them directly during his cloth-buying trips to France with his father, and when bands of them passed through Umbria. These performing artists reflected his mother's native culture and background, which he loved, and it appealed to France's romantic side, encouraged his enduring love of singing, and inspired his own later attempts to write poetry. Francis was not born a saint, and he very clearly did not behave like a saint in his early years. In later life, he would have serious regrets about his youthful indiscretions and behavior. But for now he was embarking on a new life journey that he hoped would bring fame and fortune. It would bring fame, but not for the reasons he experienced or expected. It would bring the very opposite of fortune, and in ways that young Francis could never have imagined. Excuse me. In the book, Chris Park talks about Francis' hopes and dreams. As youth gave way to adulthood, excuse me, Francis started to turn his mind to more serious things. What sort of life would he lead? What sort of person would he become? Francis knew by now that his own ambitions and his family's expectations of him were not closely aligned. It was already clear, at least to Francis, that he was not cut out to be a businessman and to run the family cloth business, as his father expected. He was still the dreamer, with visions of winning fame as a poet. Like many young men at the time, he also felt drawn to the noble life of a soldier, picturing a glittering military career ahead of him. Excuse me, just excuse me a moment. Chesterton notes that there was not at this time any external sign of anything particularly mystical about the young man. But over the course of the next few years, that was to change. The period between 1198 and 1205, when Francis was 16 to 23, was to be a formative time for him, which would set him on a course far removed from the life that he and his parents had envisaged. Many young men in those days dreamed of becoming a knight, winning in battle, being showered with fame and fortune, and most importantly, winning the hand of a beautiful young maiden. At school they learned about the legendary knights-errant of the courts of King Arthur and the Palladians of Charlemagne, who became their heroes. Francis not only dreamed of becoming a knight, he was convinced it was his destiny to do so. The cult of knighthood combined ethical and aesthetic ideals, while nobility in service and constancy in love were among its most highly regarded themes. Valor in battle was perhaps the most obvious and reasonable path towards knightly perfection. It was an exclusive club which offered glory, prestige, social standing. Every young man of means aspired to become a member. It was the medieval version of the cult of personality. Francis, ever the dreamer, was no different, and he saw it as his passport to success. What better way for an attention-seeking and social climber like him to achieve his goals? His mother Picha approved of her son's military ambition, initially at least, and she supported him as he took his first tentative steps towards achieving it. His father disapproved, still seeing him as heir to the family business. Mother won despite father's protestations. For Francis himself, it was an important part of constructing his own identity, a sense of who he was based on what he had been and who he imagined himself becoming in the future. Excuse me. Let's leave it there, because I'm halfway through the book at the moment, and as you bypass the childhood, the adolescent period, and his time in the army as a knight, and you actually come to Francis being called by the Christ, it is an amazing journey of the strictest asceticism that I've ever come across. He really purged himself, and amazingly, his simplicity attracted so many intelligent men, barristers, lawyers, teachers, to give up everything and give everything to the poor, to follow in his footsteps and become poor, like the poor. So let us conclude by showing you a beautiful gift that Sister Joy once gave me when she was receiving training. And this is the Teo symbol from France, of Francis. It's rather beautiful, don't you think? It's a large version of what we wear around our neck. It symbolizes you with your arms outstretched, saying to God, here I am, use me. But the one I love is this beautiful little icon of Francis. Simple, nothing complicated. Let us just spend a moment in reflection. Let us be still now. Let us come with Francis to the cave, and there sit with him in the silence of the night hour. And we can hear his breathing. And now we see the man of God kneeling on stones in a cold, damp cave, in total rapture with God. And you know that being in his presence, there is something edifying about his simplicity. Let us just stay with him for a moment.
Another leads you only to everything you told. In your heart you wonder which of these is true. The road that leads to nowhere, the road that leads to
each one of us, regardless of whose life we read, whether they're a Christian saint, a Hindu mystic, a Sikh holy man or woman, a Buddhist priest, a Tibetan nun, they all have something in common. They are totally detached from ego, from self, and their heart is aligned to something that they have witnessed, experienced, touched, where two hearts have become aligned in love. Let us ask the Father, Mother God to touch us where we are right now and to give us a spirit of understanding of what is God saying to us. What is the Creator God saying to our hearts, not our head, to our heart? Because something happened for Francis and his followers down through the centuries to the present day. Something nurtured that vision, and it wasn't wealth and riches, because their rule of life is quite austere. Maybe not as austere and as aesthetical as then in the 12th century, but today the Father, Mother God is using his children of different faiths to communicate a simple message, to come follow the light of divine love. And where there is that love, there is light. And where there is that light, there is love. And today, the world needs many more men and women to become less selfish and more selfless, to try and connect with the poor, to try and understand the mindset of a poor man, woman or child. And it's easy to give money to charity. It's so easy to give a donation. It's not so easy to actually work with them, as we do here when we have the travelers coming to the door and we give them accommodation and feed them, because for all we know, it could be the Christ in disguise. And who am I to judge? I am not here to judge. I'm not here to seek attention and for people to put me on a pedestal. I'm like you. I'm in service to a loving God. I'm not here to preach. I'm here to walk the talk instead of talk the walk. I hope that my short time with you this evening has given you a little insight into the window of Francis' life. It is an amazing life. And I've read his life story by various different scholars. But I have to admit, Chris Park, who's a local man, a retired academic, a professor, is not Franciscan. So he's coming to the life of Francis from a totally different angle, and that appeals to my heart, because he's not selling spirituality or religion. He's inviting you to embrace a different understanding of a man whose message is as important today as it was in the 12th century. Thank you for joining me. And a quote from Francis: may what you do, however small or insignificant, remember, you do it for God. Allow it to become your prayer. Allow it to be your greatest prayer. Namaste. Shalom inshallah. Pax et bonum om shanti. Solo di caritas. And may the peace of your God, whoever your God is, set you free to follow your heart